Welcome back, everybody, to the Peer-to-Peer Policy Podcast. I'm Brian Morgenstern here with the great Sam Lyman. We have a lot to talk about this week. Sam, where do we begin?
Let's start with the Bitcoin ETF. We've had a pretty wild ride over the past few months. Bitcoin had a monstrous pump up to $73,000 after the Bitcoin ETF was approved back in January. Since then, during the month of April, it's been pretty choppy times for Bitcoin holders. We've been ranging between $60,000 and $70,000, which is a pretty wide range. And for people who aren't used to this asset class, some of them might be pretty tired and might be thinking about potentially selling, right? So there's bears out there that are saying it's all over. It's a triple top. Bitcoin's going back down again. But then there are also bulls out there who are saying, no, we've got more room to run. This was actually just the first wave of ETF flows. So, Brian, I wanted to start with a question looking back on the initial success of this ETF. What do you make of the Bitcoin ETF? Did it overperform your expectations? Did it underperform them? And where do you think we go next from here?
I think the speed with which Bitcoin has been gobbled up by some of these large institutional players surprised me a little bit. I was confident that it would happen. I think the fact that it happened so quickly was what surprised me a little bit. But that said, there's so much more room to run. And BlackRock, of course, which switched from like Bitcoin hater to Bitcoin evangelist, is now even pointing out that there is so much more room to run. You've got, pension funds, endowments. You've got so many more large institutions around the world that could adopt it. And if we get to sort of a new normal where advisors are placing, 1% to 5% of any portfolio in Bitcoin, to avoid, missing the next run up, but while mitigating risk at the same time. That means there's just so much more demand that is still today on the sidelines that hasn't come in yet to the market. I see a tremendous upside, a tremendous future from here. And, it's just interesting that BlackRock agrees with me, considering they were on an ESG crusade for a while, and sort of a lot of ESGers tend to malign Bitcoin, but now that the prince of ESG is now also probably the most influential Bitcoin evangelist in the world at this point, I think the tide's really changing. So very bright future, very interesting times. In terms of, kind of the dip, like we saw a lot of these institutions flooding into the market and the price shoot up. Now it's sort of stabilized in the 60s. But I think, like I said, over time, it's going to be up and to the right as more and more people learn about it, get used to it. I mean, I just was talking with family about it recently and just explaining, what is Bitcoin, because a lot of people are not steeped in the details. They don't have a lot of technical knowledge. They're used to more traditional assets. And that was just sort of reinforcing to me that there's like billions of people in the world who have not yet learned about this. And the more people learn about it, the more people like it. So future is bright. I think the initial tranche was sort of a stampede there. And now we have to get the word out more and get more institutions and more retail investors involved. And the future will continue to be bright. So we'll see. I don't like to try to predict markets. We are not giving you investment advice. Always have to do that disclaimer. But I don't know. Those are my initial thoughts. It was hot and heavy there right at the beginning.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, what I found most interesting was you had analysts from Van Eck and Bloomberg who actually said that this first wave was very retail driven. I didn't expect that. So we had retail drive Bitcoin from around $44,000 to $73,000. That's incredible to contemplate. And to think that that's only the first wave makes me really excited for the future. Again, neither one of us is a financial analyst here, but we do like to read the tea leaves whenever we can to make guesses, right? But please don't follow any of this as financial advice. But Dylan, I'd like to pull up, would you mind queuing up that first graphic? So this is a report from Bitcoin magazine that institutional investors on an even higher scale are looking at Bitcoin. And so, Brian, you mentioned that there's sovereign wealth funds, there's pension funds out there that have realized that they can now gain exposure to this asset class. So, given that this first wave was retail driven, just think of what could happen in this second wave as, like you mentioned, people begin to allocate 1 to 5% of their portfolio to Bitcoin. I mean, we could go so much further from here. So it will be really interesting to watch and see how all of this develops. You mentioned something else that the more people learn about Bitcoin, the more they like it. I've heard it said that once you understand Bitcoin, you believe in it. The problem is it takes a long time to understand it, right? And so, always in the industry, we're trying to find apt metaphors to help people really make tangible what is an abstract idea, to make concrete this digital property that is Bitcoin. And people have a lot of interesting thoughts on this front. One of those people is Hunter Horsley, who works for Bitwise, and they own and they issue their own Bitcoin ETF. And do you mind pulling up that second tweet there? So this is a tweet from over the weekend or just before the weekend that Hunter Horsley had, where he said, "I'm starting to think that digital gold, that metaphor, may hold Bitcoin back. Yes, it helps evoke store value with no cash flow, but so many people and investors don't own gold, don't find it compelling, and it doesn't evoke that Bitcoin is a fast growing technology with evolving use cases, which gold is not. I wonder if a new version of gold pigeonholes Bitcoin." So, Brian, out of curiosity, what do you think of this take that Bitcoin is digital gold is actually not the best metaphor? Do you agree, disagree? Be interesting to get your thoughts on this.
I'm gonna say it's prophetic, but it is not yet true. Because we're still in that phase where we have to explain it to people and get people, to a position where they can wrap their head around it. And if you start with the idea that, gold was both a useful commodity in manufacturing or jewelry or, all the use cases for gold as a metal, as a commodity, combined with the fact that people could use gold coins and barter trade and, use it as money for centuries. It is helpful for people used to traditional money to think of gold and then explain that instead of pulling it out of the mountain, with Bitcoin, you're kind of pulling it out of the computer code. And it is effectively, it has all those functions of gold, except that it exists online instead of held in your hand. I have found that people can kind of start to wrap their head around that. Now, in terms of the future use cases and all the versatility, Bitcoin is better than gold because, as Michael Saylor has said, if you try to bring a suitcase full of gold bars on an airplane, they're not going to let you through. It is not that portable. Whereas Bitcoin, it exists online. You can travel the world. You can go wherever you want. You can send it instantaneously around the world wherever you want. So it's like gold, but it's more portable. It's more useful. It's got a supply cap. So the value should be more stable over time. All these different things. But when you start off with this idea of gold as opposed to printed US dollars, go back in time first to help explain it to people. I find digital gold actually is quite useful. As to where we're going and the evolution of Bitcoin in terms of the expansion of the use of the Lightning Network, have it be more of a payments mechanism rather than a store of value, and all the other developments that are coming seemingly more and more rapidly. Maybe we will have a better metaphor soon. But for now, I actually really find the digital gold description quite helpful for just helping people to wrap their head around it. I don't know. The uncharitable view of my statements here is that I'm just not creative enough to come up with a better one.
Mhm.
But I'll take the more optimistic route, which is that in order to bring more people into this world and help to understand why it's good, why it is helping push the world towards a more sound money paradigm, and a more instantaneous and peer-to-peer transacting world, which all of which I think is positive for humanity. I think just describing it as digital gold and the comparisons between actual gold and Bitcoin, that's helpful for getting like my family to understand it, or just normies who are not steeped in the details. So I'll stick with digital gold for now, but maybe there will be something better in the future.
I'll stick with it too. I mean, a lot of what you and I do day in and day out is just helping people grasp what Bitcoin is. It can be really hard, but in my experience, especially with boomers, digital gold is a metaphor that makes sense to them. It's something that they can grasp onto because it's this idea of scarcity. Scarcity is not too hard to understand. And with Bitcoin, you can explain that it's even more scarce than gold. Whereas we have estimates of how much gold there is on the planet Earth, we have a very real certainty of how much Bitcoin will exist over time. And so once I can explain that scarcity aspect to people, Bitcoin starts to become more tangible to them, more concrete. Some other interesting metaphors I saw out there, Eric Balkunis, in reaction to this tweet, he called Bitcoin digital hot sauce, which I enjoy because I like spicy things. And I think the point here is that if you want to spice up your portfolio a little bit, throw some Bitcoin in there. It will make things interesting, whether it goes up or down. And as we've seen over time, it tends to go up. You know, another interesting way of explaining Bitcoin is inflation-proof money. As you mentioned, the Lightning Network is continuing to develop. Coinbase just recently integrated Lightning. And so this idea of Bitcoin as a payment system, I think, will become more and more real over time. We also have seen that over the years, Bitcoin has had an inverse relationship with inflation. And so when you can explain to people, oh, you don't like the fact that your dollar is losing its value and becoming debased, there's another monetary network out there, and that monetary network is Bitcoin. And it exists outside of the US dollar system. And in that sense is really inflation proof in a lot of ways. So there's different ways to describe it. And I think the more that we see inflation rise, the more that we see the Fed print, the more and more relevant this monetary network will become. So on that exact subject, we saw a fascinating clip over the weekend from the top economist from the White House, Mr. Bernstein. And in this clip, he's asked to explain more or less what money printing is. And he reveals himself to be completely incapable of explaining what money printing is and why it might not be a good idea. Dylan, do you mind playing that clip?
The U.S. government can't go bankrupt because we can print our own money.
It obviously begs the question, why exactly are we borrowing in a currency that we print ourselves? I'm waiting for someone to stand up and say, why do we borrow our own currency in the first place?
Like you said, they print the dollar. So why does the government even borrow?
Well, again, some of this stuff gets, some of the language that some of the language and concepts are just confusing. I mean, the government definitely prints money, and it definitely lends that money, which is why the government definitely prints money, and then it lends that money by selling bonds. Is that what they do? They sell bonds. Yeah, they sell bonds, right? Because they sell bonds and people buy the bonds and lend them the money. Yeah. So a lot of times, at least to my ear with MMT, the language and the concepts can be kind of unnecessarily confusing, but there is no question that the government prints money and then it uses that money to I guess I can't really talk. I don't get it. I don't know what they're talking about. Like, because it's like the government clearly prints money. It does it all the time, and it clearly borrows. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this debt and deficit conversation. So I don't think there's anything confusing there.
What?
I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul. What was that? Oh,
I feel bad for him.
I do too. I cringe. Just like the hair on the back of my neck is standing up. That is so sad. This is, I do have a little bit of schadenfreude though, because this is the same gentleman whose office proposed a tax on the electricity used to maintain the Bitcoin network, because They hate Bitcoin because they want to be able to print unlimited US dollars and have no sound money asset to sort of imply or just demonstrate for people's eyes and ears how bad it is to just have unlimited money printing. We've said it before. Since 2020, the US dollar has lost about 25% of its value, in part because the government is running $2 trillion deficits because he referred to the MMT, or so modern monetary theory, which is espoused by the likes of AOC and others on the far left. I was heartened. I'll give Mr. Bernstein a cookie here. I was heartened to see him sort of wave his hand at MMT, saying he doesn't even get that. Okay. But the behavior of this government says otherwise, because they do believe they can engage in unlimited money printing. But let's go to economics 101. If there's more dollars flooding the market, it means each dollar is worth less. So if your savings is in US dollars, if it's just in a savings account, even if it's, a relatively high yield savings account, if inflation is outpacing that, then your US dollar is a melting ice cube. And it's because they keep printing more of them, because they think they can just print forever and that there will be no adverse consequences. That was super cringe worthy. It was very upsetting. And it has led us to find out more information about Mr. Bernstein, which is that as the chief economist at the White House, his degrees are actually in music and social work. So why is he the chief economist at the White House would be my first question. So why was he in a position to have to answer that question to begin with, is number one. And number two, after he did answer that question that way, why is he still the chief economist at the White House? So very strange, upsetting developments. It should not breed confidence in our government's fiscal and otherwise economic policies. Wow. Just wow. I mean, that's a Veep moment, but unfortunately, it's a very serious topic to see a Veep moment on. Sad.
A Veep moment indeed. And I love it when people who are pro MMT or pro money printing of any kind, they say, oh, a government can't go bankrupt because it can just print its own money. Tell that to the people of Zimbabwe. Tell that to the people of Venezuela. Tell that to the people of Germany in the era of the Weimar Republic. Sure, you can print your own money ad infinitum, but that's going to debase the currency till it's worthless and people will go bankrupt. So you haven't figured out anything special there, MMTers. That is how you bankrupt an entire people. And that's the trajectory that we're on if we don't change course. It's really dangerous. And I shudder to think that there are more men like Jared Bernstein in government who are having Veep moments like that on the daily, which begs an interesting question, Brian. You know, you and I have been in DC for a while. You've been in Congress, you've been in the Treasury Department, the White House. You know this city like the back of your hand, right? And so I think it'd be an interesting conversation for people who haven't lived in DC, haven't worked here. They have different conceptions of what DC is like. You've got 3 TV shows, right? You've got The West Wing, which is the Aaron Sorkin idealized version of DC. Everyone here is incredibly intelligent and speaks like Shakespeare and is really witty and quick and has, infinite pop culture references that they can pull from. And they are at the helm of government and guiding us in the right direction. That's one conception, right? Then you have, of course, House of Cards, which is an extremely cynical take on DC. And I know the opening scene in House of Cards, the main character, a politician, he kills a dog. I want to say we're not House of Cards, but then Christine Noem just recently killed a dog. So we could be wrong on that. Anyways, then there's the third conception of DC, which is Veep, featuring Julia Louis-Dreyfus of Seinfeld fame, and she is a vice president. And it just displays DC and the people of DC as complete incompetence, imbeciles, if you will. People who don't really know what they're doing, they're making it up as they go. So that's my question, Brian. Having seen this Mr. Bernstein clip, having worked in this city for a long time, is DC more West Wing or is it more Veep?
Short answer is Veep, 100%. The longer answer is that I think as you spend a long time in DC, there's elements of each. So I think when you arrive here and you are super optimistic and patriotic, and you want to help, make the world a better place and serve your country, I think you start off thinking of it as the West Wing and the Aaron Sorkin idealized version. When you get down in the mud with some of the entrenched interests here and the power struggles that are going on behind the scenes, whether it is, no matter the policy area, but especially when you think about some of the more difficult quagmires in the world, you get into the intelligence community, defense policy. Eisenhower famously warned of the defense industrial complex. There can be some very dark sides to DC, and there can be elements of House of Cards with such intense competition. Just a surface level introduction to that would be, here people love to get titles and have very important jobs. And sometimes to get those, you have to push people out. You have to push out the incumbent occupant of that job. So a lot of times people will kind of run an op. They will place negative stories about the person in the press. Well, first they have to dig them up, then they place them, then they make sure those stories are shown to the correct people to try to make sure that, whoever that incumbent is has their name kind of muddied up, and then can push them aside, and then the new candidate for whatever that position is can kind of slide in. That's just one classic example of like House of Cardsy in DC. But once you've been here long enough and you have seen some of the serious parts, you've seen some of the really harshly fierce competitive parts, and then you get you have a nice thick skin and a good sense of humor about things, you start to see it really through the lens of Veep. And there are many moments that were Veepish over my time in government. I mean, one example, I think now with the benefit of hindsight, a couple of years on, we can think of it in this way. But during the coronavirus pandemic, when I worked at the White House, this really could be an episode of Veep. There was a gathering of people in my office, the press and communications office, where they had a chili cook-off. And I was not present. I was otherwise occupied that night. I wasn't there for whatever reason. They all got coronavirus. They all got COVID. It was the COVID chili cook-off, which meant that for the next 10 to 14 days, I was literally the only person on campus in the White House and doing interviews. Everybody else was like on their Zoom cameras with their ring lights saying like, hey, what's going on there? I'm missing out, sitting at home by themselves. Of course, at some point then during that period of time, the president himself got coronavirus and had to go off to Walter Reed. It was a wild time. Because there was no one else in the office, I remember Andrew Giuliani, who helped to run the Office of Public Liaison, which dealt with all the outside groups, businesses, sports teams, celebrities. I mean, anybody who was coming to the White House, his office would process that. Well, during the pandemic, nobody could come to the White House. They had some pretty strict, limitations. And so basically Andrew dubbed himself my intern, and we were the only two people in the press office for quite a while because everybody else got COVID at the same time. It totally could have been an episode of Veep. It was ridiculous. But there are many others. There was the first day of baseball in 2020 when Major League Baseball was coming back, and we were talking with Major League Baseball and the Nationals, Washington Nationals, to have President Trump potentially throw out the first pitch to launch the season, to say we're reopening America, we're back, no more lockdowns, we can do this. And behind the scenes, lo and behold, Dr. Fauci and the owners of the Nationals got ahead of Major League Baseball and got him invited, Dr. Fauci invited to throw out the first pitch instead of the president.
What?
And they released this press release before MLB or the White House could figure it out. So talk about egomania. First of all, that's just editorial point on Dr. Fauci.
He scooped the president.
Ridiculous. But it all worked out great because what happened was we thought on our feet. We came up with an alternative event, which was to have little leaguers from Pennsylvania and Hall of Famer Mariano Rivera come to the White House and play catch with the president on the South Lawn and have ESPN film it. And it was awesome. It was like the coolest stagecraft
Let's go.
and most fun day ever. And then we did an interview with Dave Portnoy from Barstool Sports in the Rose Garden, which was one of the most entertaining conversations. You imagine Donald Trump and Dave Portnoy just like hanging out, talking about what it's like to be famous and then become president. I mean, it was a great day. It was very cool. So it all worked out in the end. But I mean, come on, that's a pretty good Veep moment. I think if it were actually Veep, though, it would not have worked out well in the end. We would have had to find some kind of disaster or calamity to make it like funnier instead of like actually fun and optimistic and uplifting. Yeah. To make it a Veep episode, the bottom has to fall out from underneath it, but it didn't in that instance. Anyway, end of story time for now.
Okay. Well, quick question with that story. Was that the pitch that Anthony Fauci threw out and it was the worst pitch ever?
Oh, that's
right. Like straight into the ground.
There's your poetic justice for the Veep episode. That's right. So he gets himself invited and then he throws out the first pitch and he basically bowled it somewhere between like the on deck circle and the dugout. Like, I mean, he missed the plate by like 100 feet. And it barely was even off the ground. It was, okay, here we go. Dylan, yes, we can watch the single worst first pitch of all time.
Yeah, when I remember when he did this pitch, it looked like he was spiking a football. That was my first thought. I'm like, is this the sport of baseball?
I'm not sure whose was worse. There it is.
To throw out the ceremonial first pitch.
Oh, that's karma.
Yeah.
That's what happens when you scoop the president of the United States.
Yes. Sweet, sweet justice. Yeah, what a wild time. But there's another example of a real life Veep episode for you.
Yeah. Okay. So it's disconcerting probably for a lot of listeners to hear that DC is more like Veep. And it might say something about the future of our monetary policy in the US. How in any way could we possibly tie this back to Bitcoin?
So Bitcoin, look, we call this the peer-to-peer policy pod because one aspect of Bitcoin is that if you're doing on-chain transactions, by that I mean, as opposed to holding it in your brokerage account. Of course, now we have, and I should explain the Lightning Network a little bit. That is just they call it a layer 2. It's where you're not directly on Bitcoin's blockchain, but you're transacting. Basically, if you're buying a cup of coffee, there are several apps out there where you can pay with Bitcoin instantaneously, just like you would pay with your Apple Wallet or whatever else. But the real point here is that the Bitcoin network exists independently. It is maintained by thousands of computers all around the world that have carbon copies of what in effect are carbon copies of Bitcoin's blockchain, which is data. It is timestamps and shows that there's only, this Bitcoin is unique. It only exists in this wallet at this time. If people transact, then that exact asset is transferred to another place at a specific point in time, and there's no double spending. You can't. It's kind of anti-fraud, essentially. But the point being is that it's this independent network, and you don't have to trust a bank. You don't have to trust a government. You can transact. Sam and I can transact on a peer-to-peer basis, and you don't have to involve clearing that can take days and cost, ungodly amounts of fees for every transaction. It's peer-to-peer and in a decentralized, self-maintained network. So you don't have to fear a government overprinting and debasing that currency. You don't have to fear a bank collapsing and your assets not being adequately insured by the FDIC or otherwise. It is the ability for individuals to be their own bank, to hold their own assets, and to not worry about a government or a bank messing up. And now governments and banks typically over, a long, long time have built up this reputation for trust, and people insist that, holding your assets in these things in financial institutions is the safest way to do it. Since 2008, trust in that traditional system has eroded because we had such large institutions collapse. And just last year, when we had mid-size institutions start to collapse, I think those kind of fears started to be renewed. So the point is, eventually I always get to the point, is this is an alternative for people to hold some amount of wealth in a sound, limited, scarce asset on a decentralized network where you hold the keys to your assets and you don't have to rely on someone else. So it's an alternative. I think it's something of a safe haven. And I think that's why a lot of people are getting more and more interested in it, because they see the profligate spending. They see the uncertainty with interest rates. They see a lot of financial institutions not doing well. And they're looking to hedge their bets, as any safe, as any smart investor would do, diversify and secure your future. So Bitcoin is one way of doing that. I hope I've explained it adequately. I used way too many words as always, but hopefully that answers your question.
No, I like that. Maybe summarizing, Bitcoin is Veep proof money.
There you go. There's your new your new metaphor.
Right.
Yeah.
Veep proof money. If you don't want people like Jared Bernstein messing with the value of your currency, an option is Bitcoin. Bitcoin removes the human factor from the equation of the economy and money. And what is managed and oftentimes distorted by humans in the US dollar system and other economies is managed and fixed by mathematics in the Bitcoin network. And I think that's a key difference for people to understand is Bitcoin is immutable. A fancy way of saying you can't change the Bitcoin network. It's virtually impossible to do so. And so if you're tired of money printing, if you're tired of the constant debasement of your savings, if you're tired of men like Jared Bernstein saying that, a government can't go bankrupt because it can just print its own money, and you can see the obvious falsity or the obvious falsehoods behind that, then Bitcoin is an option. And I think more and more people will turn to it as inflation continues to be a serious problem. So on this front, we saw a really interesting poll from Gallup over the last week. Dylan, would you mind pulling up this poll? So for the last decade, the Fed has had a target rate of inflation of 2%. And over the last few years, since the COVID money print, the Fed has all but abandoned that target inflation rate. They're now trying to target something more around 3% of inflation. So this poll says that 41% of Americans say that inflation is now the biggest problem facing them and their families. That's huge. In other words, inflation is more of a problem than immigration, than climate change, than all these issues that we often hear in the news. Of all of them, inflation is what is worrying American families the most. There's also another interesting poll. Dylan, would you mind pulling this up? This poll shows that among young Americans, their greatest concern is also inflation. So, and if we could just go back to the Gallup poll for a second, Dylan, this is a huge problem. I mean, we know it's a problem. We feel it in our day-to-day every time we go to the grocery store. I guess my first question is, how did we get here? How might this affect the election this November? And where do we go? Is there any putting the inflation genie back in the bottle?
Yeah, it's a really, really difficult, practically intractable problem. I think if this election winds up being about inflation, I think that favors the party out of power because people are just looking for change at that point. I think the other issues that are entering the chat are immigration and, of course, abortion, which motivates a certain swath of the electorate that may be swing voters. And so that could have a huge impact. But if inflation, if this holds up as the number one issue for people that they are concerned about, that favors the party out of power. If we get in, same with immigration, because it's about the status quo versus a change. On abortion policy, that tends to, if that is the focus, then in this case, the Democrats, the party in power, likely benefit there. So that's just kind of the electoral dynamics, I would say. In terms of how'd we get here, to your question. So Secretary Mnuchin, who was my boss at the Treasury Department during the coronavirus pandemic, that we passed the CARES Act and then reloaded some of those social benefit programs because, remember, at the beginning of the pandemic, we didn't know a lot. We had lockdowns for a little while. We had to make sure that small businesses could survive the temporary disruptions. He said recently, and I think he's 100% right, that if we had to go back and do it all over again, that short term, while we were uncertain, some of those programs made a lot of sense. Towards the end of the Trump administration, so into the end of 2020, early 2021, and then after Biden came in, there was more and more spending that now, with the benefit of hindsight, should not have done that. We should have cut that off. And in addition to continuing benefits that didn't need to continue, because most places were reopening and the economy was starting to function again as normal. So at that point, you really were just flooding the market with dollars and debasing the dollar. And then there was subsequent multi-trillion-dollar spending programs added on top of those excessive benefits. So really, it's been government spending. I would add a component that the Fed was really late to raise rates because, and this was admitted by one of the vice chairs, politics got in the way. Jerome Powell, the chair of the Fed, his term was up. The Fed was trying to figure out who their leader was going to be, if he would continue or if it would be someone else. And when you're trying to convince a president to renominate you, you typically are not going to be raising interest rates to do that, because presidents hate it when interest rates go up. It makes money supply tighter. It can affect the stock market. It can be very disruptive. So they waited, I think, about 6 months too long to raise rates because of politics. Combine that with the fact that they just overspent because they thought you can just, because they have that mindset of we can print unlimited money. Now you have a money supply that's it's just flooded. And so I think that's kind of how we got here. And there's concerns that if they tighten too much, that you're going to then cause unemployment, you're going to cause a recession. So they're trying to walk this tightrope now. But I don't think we needed to be in this position if they had just tightened the belt. I think at the end of the Trump administration and beginning of the Biden administration, then I think we would be in a much healthier position than we are now. But we are where we are. So you have to then hope that our policymakers are going to take corrective action. The problem is people aren't seeing it. They don't see any appetite for cutting spending. They don't see any appetite for really kind of tightening the belt and trying to restore the value of the dollar, especially because compared to other countries, we're still stronger. And so that kind of is a buoy that's just like keeping us afloat. But common sense would dictate that when you have rapid inflation the way we have it now, you have to take counter-inflationary measures, which means cutting government spending, stopping the relentless money printing. I'm hopeful that at some point, somebody is going to have enough common sense and prevail on our policymakers in DC. It's just people aren't really seeing it right now. I'm not really seeing it right now. But hope springs eternal. So again, too many words, but there's your explanation.
Oh, hope springs eternal. I am worried though, because Brian, as you mentioned, the Fed waited too long to start raising rates again for political reasons, right? I think we're seeing that same dynamic at play right now, where you have Jerome Powell, who recently became more hawkish when it came to interest rates because inflation is running so hot. But I think there might be an argument to be made that we shouldn't be cutting rates anytime soon. But I think there's still a good chance that it will happen sometime before the election, because there are political considerations that he has where he doesn't want to anger the president in office. And so he has more of an incentive to cut rates, because cuts rates, the economy will be hot, and it might increase the chances of reelection for his the current president, President Biden. So scary situation all around, something to be really concerned about. But inflation is a consistent theme on the show, and it's what makes Bitcoin a very attractive asset to a lot of people. So it always gives us something to talk about. Now, to close today, why don't we talk about one of your favorite moments from this last week on SNL? We want to pull that up, Dylan, and Brian, you want to talk about what gave you a kick out of this clip?
Yeah, let's do. Yeah, our draft tweets. I didn't tweet anything really about this clip, but I found it very entertaining. So I went to Columbia Law School. Columbia has been in the news for all the wrong reasons recently, and that was a topic on SNL this week, which I got a kick out of. So Dylan, why don't we play the clip for the audience?
Encouraging. Alphonse, your daughter must feel so supported when she's out there.
What's that now? when whose daughter is out there?
At the protest.
No, man. You bugging. Alexis Vanessa Roberts better have her butt in class. Mm-hmm. Let me find out she in one of them damn tents instead of the dorm room that I pay for.
Wait, I thought you were in favor of the student protest.
Brother, man, I am supportive of y'all's kids protesting. Not my kids. My kids know better. Shoot, Alexis Vanessa ain't crazy.
Well, Alphonse, your daughter attends Columbia. What do you think about the students that took over Hamilton Hall?
That's good for y'all's kids. But they ain't mine. That's all I'm saying. They ain't my kids. You feel me, Ryan?
Yes, I feel you, Alphonse. But tell me, with the rise in attendance in these protests, how does it make you feel to see the increase in police presence? Sarah, are you concerned about students being arrested?
I think we're good.
Very.
That was the gist of just oh no, not my kid. My kid will be in class. I went to Columbia. I think I did the math on how much it costs per class. It is one of the most expensive institutions in the world. I was not going to be skipping class to go protest, certainly not to sympathize with terrorist groups, or go glamping with my friends and then make bizarre demands. It has not been going well, which brings me to a brief little professor's corner on a topic that I think is very important. Free speech is obviously hugely important, but in the Supreme Court case law on this is something called the heckler's veto. And there was a case, for example, very important case where many decades ago, there was a group of Nazis, American like neo-Nazis, that were staging a protest. And the community, as you might imagine, was not happy about this. And they went to their government and said, you can't give these guys a permit because it will lead to violence, essentially by us, because we are going to beat the holy bejesus out of these guys because they're Nazis. Well, that's not how things work in America. You may detest what people have to say, but they have a right to say it. And the government's responsibility, now in this case, it's a private institution, but I think the principle still holds that there's an obligation to provide a secure environment with you can have very strict time, place, and manner restrictions. People have a right to make their voices heard, but they can do it in specific places at specific times so that you're not disrupting everyday life for people. But now you have essentially the hecklers are in charge of the protest at Columbia, breaking into buildings and disrupting school. And now you have students, the law school, the law review saying we need to have exams canceled and everybody get an automatic passing grade because we're so traumatized because these Looney Tunes have not been, adhering to normal like behavior. they've been totally crazy, violent, trespassing, issuing all kinds of demands. What should happen based on Supreme Court case law, if adopted by this private institution, what they should have said was, here's a specific place and specific hours where you can have your protest and we'll protect you and make sure that you can have your voice heard. And then it's done. And then but you can't disrupt people going to class. You can't disrupt people taking exams. You can't do violent things like breaking and entering, for example. You get arrested for that. You should be. But we've had administrators so terrified of these Hamas glampers, like putting their tents in the courtyard and then breaking into buildings and screaming and yelling like lunatics. Like, you can't put up with that. Like I said, time, place, and manner restrictions. You can't have a heckler's veto situation where people threaten violence as a way of disrupting everyone else's ability to live their life and have their voices heard. You have to have an orderly society. We have lost that. So that is a long way of saying I'm with Alphonse. If I were a Columbia parent today, my kid would be in class, not engaging in crazy behavior. That is all. I don't know. I'm old man, get off my lawn, I guess. But I think hopefully a lot of people agree with me.
I think a lot of people on both the left and the right agree with you. What I thought was so funny about these protests, Dylan, this was something that you mentioned beforehand, is the list of demands that these students were making. It's the height of privilege. They were saying, we demand hot food and water, and we demand breakfast, but no bagels. To say we demand food, but no bagels. Like, how anti-Semitic do you have to be to not eat bagels to swear them off? I mean, that is a sad state.
In New York City, the home of the best bagels like on earth. Yeah, that is both horribly offensive in its cartoonish level of anti-Semitism, but also just like bad taste in food. So yeah, poorly done, protesters. You gotta, I don't know, just tone it down, go to class, take your exams. Also, your protests aren't working. Like, this reminds me of when I was an undergraduate at Georgetown and the Iraq War was going on, and there were protesters who didn't like the Iraq War, whose opinions, by the way, over time, have probably aged okay. However, their tactics, again, were ridiculous. They were taking over a portion of campus. They were setting up their tents, and they were, protesting for like days and weeks on end. And I remember there was a satire article that came out where it said Vice President Cheney came bounding into the Oval Office and said to President Bush, "Mr. President, I think we have to reconsider our war strategy." And President Bush said, "Why?" And Cheney said, "Because there are some weird students camping at Georgetown." And Bush said, "Well, that's it. Bring the boys home. War is over." Like, it's not working. You're looking cuckoo. What you're really protesting is your ability to get a job in the future, unfortunately. So, again, if you just made your voices heard for a specific period of time in a specific place, and then let everybody go about their lives, then I think your message would be better received. But the violence, trespassing, window breaking, and anti-Semitic food demands are muddying the waters. They're making you look a little cuckoo. But glad SNL is adopting a common sense view these days. And yeah, go back inside, kids. Stop canceling graduations. That is the more you know. That's my message for this week.
That's good stuff. My last thought on that, watching these protests on college campuses spring up across the country makes me think something really interesting about American politics over the past several years. And that is, it's all a LARP. So for those of you who don't know what LARPing is an acronym that means live action role playing. You ever see nerds with neck beards and heavy set bellies fighting each other with medieval swords? That's what LARPing is. That's where the term originates from. And that's what we're seeing on college campuses across the country right now is a lot of these student protests, they're LARPing as if they were Gaza, as if they were, in Israel, and as if they're persecuted and how they're standing up against a corrupt regime. They all are looking for more meaning in their lives, these students. I find that it's humorous to some extent, but it's also sad. It makes me feel for these students who clearly lack, I think it's religion at the end of the day, and they think that they're not religious people by spurning religion and by becoming secular. But some secular people are also the most religious people I know, because they have spun in their minds this narrative that they're sticking to, that they are always for the oppressed, that they're always doing the right thing, and that those who don't understand their political agenda, they're the Gentiles. They're the ones who don't understand. They're the heathens, so to speak. And it's a very binary way of viewing at the world. And it's a real sad commentary on the state of our universities, that we're training up the next ruling class at these Ivy League universities to have this very childish way of looking at the world. It's juvenile, and it makes me sad. And I hope that this leaves an opening for other students at state colleges, for example, who are counter protesting a lot of these Gaza protests and chanting USA, singing the national anthem. I have so much more hope in students like that than I do in these entitled students at Ivy League universities who pretend like they're this beleaguered, embattled minority class, when in reality, they're some of the most privileged people in the country. It reminds me of a William F. Buckley quote: "I'd rather be ruled by the first 2,000 names I find in the phone book than the faculty of Harvard." And that's what I see and think of every time I see these protests and just the histrionics on display here. These people they're not fit to rule in the next 10 to 20 years in America, but that's probably the trajectory that they're on. And so it's concerning, but I also am ever hopeful that because this is America, common sense wins out at the end of the day. And so I'm hopeful too, Brian, that things will change. But those are my 2 cents on the Gaza protests going up.
That's heavy. Yeah, no, and that's about right. The overeducated, I think, need to be knocked down a peg a little bit. Common sense prevails, and people like to love where they're from. They like to be proud of their family and their homeland. And yeah, I think the reaction, I agree. The reaction by a lot of those, by the frat boys, the frat boys will save us, I think, is what we learned from this week when they came out with their, protecting the American flags. The young men at North Carolina, I think it was North Carolina, who raised $500,000 for a Rager with the help of Democrat donor Bill Ackman. I love it. It's hilarious and restores my faith in humanity. So yes, pretty heavy non-Bitcoin related topic, but hopefully we kept it light. And I want to go to that party. I think that's my closing thought. But thanks everybody for joining us. Hit that subscribe button, like and subscribe. Find us on Twitter at SamLyman33, at MorganSternNJ, and we will be back with you next time on the Peer to Peer Policy Pod.